Well, howdy folks. I'm Hank and this here's CBMF. Now, y'all might be wondering why I'm sort of affecting a little bit of an accent right now. It's because I've been watching Preacher. No, I'm not going to keep that up. That's kind of silly. I'm not going to do my Southern Preacher bit for you guys. I might lapse in and out of it a little bit because I got to admit that listening to that dialogue and flipping through the book, it does kind of put you in a south of Texas kind of mode. Remember the Alamode? Those Texans love ice cream on their apple pie. Where was I? So what can I tell you about Preacher? Preacher might be one of my all-time favorite comic book series, which is a phrase I use all too much. I have way too many all-time favorite things. However, Preacher is a big one for me. Every once in a while when I'm selling it to somebody in the comic book store, I'll tell them, if the whole shop was burning down and I could only take one series out to keep, I'd take Preacher. I first read Preacher in 1996. I bought it the summer after I graduated from high school, along with Neil Gaiman's Death, The High Cost of Living. And it changed my world. It really did. I read comic books all my life, but I'd never ever read anything like Preacher. And once I read it, I couldn't go back. I think I pretty much stopped reading superhero comics right after I bought the first Preacher graphic novel. There was a lot of things I couldn't read anymore. There was a lot of, once you've seen how good things can be, it's hard to go back. Preacher really spoke to me. So I was real excited when I heard about this TV show happening. One of the guys who's doing it, Seth, he's from the very city I live in right now. I think there's a very good chance that him and I went to the same comic book stores in West Vancouver and bought Preacher on the same new comic book days. That's kind of a cool thought. It makes me feel a little connected to what's going on. So Preacher, this seminal cult comic book series published by DC Comics through their Vertigo Comics imprint, written by Garth Ennis, drawn by Steve Dillon, originally colored by Matt Hollingsworth, though Pamela Rambeau does the later half of the series. Axel Alonso, who is now, I believe, the head editor at Marvel, or editor-in-chief, I guess is what they call it. Axel Alonso was the dude who was largely responsible for getting Preacher out, or that's one of the things people say. Anyways, one of the best comic book series of all time, if you're into very violent, strange, button-pushing, well-fucking-written and well-fucking-drawn comic books. If you don't like good things, then maybe you won't enjoy it. My big sell on Preacher is always to ask a person if they're into Quentin Tarantino. If you like the movies of Quentin Tarantino, you'll probably enjoy Preacher. If you're one of those people who really doesn't care for the movies of Tarantino, then you're probably not going to enjoy Preacher. It kind of pushes all the same buttons. It's very funny, it's very rude, it's very violent, it's very sexual, it's very mature, and it's so fucking well written that there's a very good chance it might change your life. So, Preacher, episode 1. Let's fucking dig into this shit, right? At first I was a little thrown by the casting. Dominic Cooper is English. And Jesse Custer is Texan, and I was a little concerned that maybe he wouldn't be able to pull off the accent, and it turns out those concerns were justified. It's not terrible, but if I met this dude on the street and he was talking to me that way, there'd hit a point where I'd say, are you an Englishman trying to make me think that you're from the southern states? Because it's not working super well. That is a very, very harsh interpretation. Having watched the show, now I get it. I get what he's bringing to the role. I get what his personality brings to it. And honestly, Preacher was written by an Irishman. There was never a point in time where Preacher had an authentic Texan or American voice. So, if anything, I think it makes sense to have Canadians writing it. Well, some. If anything, I think it makes sense to have a British actor playing Jesse Custer. I think you almost could have brought in an Irishman to play him, and that would have been kind of ridiculous, but I mean, that's what the book was. Now, it is a little difficult to talk about Preacher the TV series and Preacher the book. because they are drastically different animals. It's hard to draw comparisons between the two constantly because they ain't really got that much in common. Aside from the names, some places. Having watched a few episodes of Preacher now, I can say what it reminds me of is it's like somebody took a hamburger, my favorite food in the world, and they took all the ingredients and they chopped them all up separately and they made it into a roll of sushi. I don't mind sushi, but it's not a hamburger. And that's kind of how I feel about Preacher the TV series. It also kind of reminds me a lot of Evil Dead 2. And I gotta admit, there was a part of me, I was hoping when I heard that they were gonna do a Preacher TV show, I was hoping it was gonna remind me of Pulp Fiction, or it was gonna remind me, quite honestly, of True Detective. I sort of thought of Preacher as that kind of a horror series, and instead, it reminds me of Evil Dead 2. There's nothing wrong with that. I love Evil Dead 2. It's not one of my favorite movies. I'm not gonna show it to you and say this is one of the greatest works of art and literature ever made, but I've probably seen it like 15 times, and I loved it every time. So there's nothing wrong with that. Maybe this Preacher TV show won't blow me away like Fargo the TV show did, or again like True Detective Season 1 did. That's fine. It can be something else. So what is it? The first episode's a pilot, and you can see the limitations that have been placed upon it. Anytime they can get away with not showing something, they don't show it. You can tell, you can see the limitations on casting and on budget. You can see that they needed to put a certain number of action sequences for each one of the main characters. You needed to establish them. It couldn't be a pilot that was full of mystery. There is a large mystery in it, but every one of the main characters gets a real, well, hey there, folks. Here's who I am, and this is what I'm all about kind of scene. And that's fine. You know, I mean, again, it's a TV show pilot. You know what pilots are, right?
Pilot? What's a pilot?
Well, you know the shows on TV?
I don't watch TV.
Yeah, but you are aware that there's an invention called television, and on this invention they show shows, right?
Yeah.
Well, the way they pick TV shows is they make one show. That show's called a pilot. Then they show that one show to the people who pick shows, and on the strength of that one show, they decide if they want to make more shows. Some get chosen and become television programs. Some don't. Become nothing.
Okay, good. So, what did we learn from the first episode of Preacher? We learned that it's going to be a very different thing from the book. Right off the bat, Jesse Custer's father is a preacher of the TV series. In the book, he was an American soldier. He was a Marine. And that is the pretty much number one thing we know about John Custer, Jesse Custer's father, is that he was a Marine. He fought for America in the Vietnam War, and he died at the hands of the other side of Jesse's family. Now in this, John Custer is maybe the character who is the most different, which is kind of odd to me, or interesting, I should say, because John Custer is a very powerful force for being a background character in the comic book. When I saw what they were doing with John Custer, that's when I realized, okay, this is going to be something different. I'm not sure what I make of him. Now, another thing that we got to talk about that is difficult to talk about, and I personally don't think I am the right person to be talking about this because I'm a white dude from northern Canada, and there's a whole bunch of what I'm about to talk about that I'm not really the best educated on. There are racial issues in Preacher. Some of these things they embrace, and you can tell that they're trying to talk about it without necessarily talking about it out loud. They switched the ethnicity of Tulip, who was a white character in the books, to being a black character now in the TV show. I think part of that was to add some diversity to the cast, and that it also shows that both Jesse and Cassidy, while they are surrounded by hillbillies and rednecks, are themselves open-minded guys because they don't see Tulip for her ethnicity, they see her for who she is as a person. Which I feel like they may have fucked up a little bit in subsequent episodes, but we're gonna leave that for right now. For right now, I want to talk about what I feel like they may have fucked up in the first episode. Preacher's a good show. I'm enjoying it, but I don't know if it needed to open on what felt like a really poorly thought out depiction of a African religious congregation. I have a couple of friends who specifically said that they thought that portrayal of Africa and Africans, especially that it was so generically just Africa, that they don't say, Africa, there are countries within Africa. You don't just say the continent. When they show you North America, nobody just says North America. They say America or Canada or Mexico, despite that all those places and everywhere in that North America and South America, we're all Americans. That's one of those weird. Anyway, I don't know if it was a real great move for Preacher to start off by exploding a weird stereotype of an African preacher. In the first episode of Preacher, we're introduced to all the main cast. Jesse, Tulip, Cassidy, Arseface's father, Hugo Root, all the sort of background characters who are going to be really playing things up. Right off the bat, we're shown a little bit of foreshadowing with a Steve Dillon-esque silhouette of the Saint of Killers seen on the bottle of booze that Jesse's drinking. There's some really nice little moments in this. Another thing that brought me on board with this series is when I noticed that Jesse had a tattoo in the center of his back, which is clearly a bit of his dark past. That tattoo, the design of it, is taken directly from the pages of the comic, where Jesse never had a tattoo. But if you look at Steve Dillon's illustration of the front gates when Jesse goes back home, you'll see that same symbol. I thought that was a really nice touch. That was one of the areas where I was like, okay, well, at least if you guys are bringing new stuff to the series, you're taking that new stuff from different points in the book. So it doesn't feel like somebody's just making shit up on the fly to make themselves feel cool. It feels like everything is researched. It feels like the guys who are making this show really care about the book, even if they're kind of throwing the book out to make their own show. It's a very risky move, but I think, it's maybe all you can do. Yeah, there's two paths. You either make exactly what's on the page beat for beat, or you tell a new story with all the pieces. And they've elected to tell a new story with all the pieces. And I'm really interested to see where that goes. And it means I can't just judge stuff holding up a page of comic book art every time there is a scene on the TV show and say, well, here's what this should have been, and bop, bop, bop. It's a whole different animal. And that's cool. There's a lot of violence. There's a lot of violence in the show, some of it on screen, some of it off. I think this is some of the violence I've enjoyed in the program the most. Jesse's fight scene was pretty well done. I liked a little bit at the end, the breaking the guy's arm. That felt good in Jesse Custer. It felt, there's violence, and then there's taking it an extra step. And if you're going to do Preacher, it's all about taking that extra step. Anybody can beat up a redneck and punch him in the face. Jesse Custer is going to hold that guy's arm up and snap it in half. I believe in the comic, one of the first times Jesse Custer, you see him get into a fight with some redneck piece of shit, the first move Jesse does is to rip the guy's nostril out with one finger, which is one of those fight techniques that not everybody wants to tell you is a really good technique, but I know I've read about it and sort of what they train military dudes with is yeah, if you're in a street fight and you want to win really quickly, it's a lot easier to rip a guy's ear off than it is to beat him unconscious. And once you rip a dude's ear off, he's gonna go into shock and freak out, unless he's some sort of real tough guy or a sociopath, in which case you'll have to use your crazy martial arts skills. I know nothing. I've never been in a fight. Don't listen to me. Don't listen to Jesse Custer, man. He was written by Seth Rogen and Garth Ennis. I don't believe either of those two guys have ever been in a fight either, so he makes it look a lot easier than it is. He makes it look a lot cooler than it is, too. I mean, it's hard to not read a bunch of issues of Preacher and think to yourself, man, I'm gonna go kick the shit out of someone. It's gonna be fucking badass. Don't do that. Just read Preacher. Just read Preacher and be glad that you don't have to kick the shit out of anybody. Hopefully you don't have to kick the shit out of anybody. I don't know, man. Maybe you live a rougher life than I do. A lot of people do. So what did we learn in our first episode of Preacher? We see all of our primary characters. We see Cassidy surviving a plane crash, eating a cow, drinking blood. We see Tulip, obviously some sort of assassin for hire in a sort of low rent trailer park kind of way. We see Jesse's town, kind of a fucked up place full of interesting characters. At the end of the episode, we see Jesse get what we're going to know as Genesis, or the Word of God. I really enjoyed the portrayal, how they showed Genesis. I got to admit, the 1950s sci-fi beginning, when they showed the outer space stuff, those are some of my favorite moments of the whole series. I thought they got that stuff just right. The sound of the siren, the sort of crackle that plays, the aged film look to the stars and the planets. I fucking love that stuff. That's part of where they really brought me on board. They really brought me on board when they used Time of the Preacher by Willie Nelson, as is in the opening of the comic book. I really like those kind of moments, and it was really important to me. I think Time of the Preacher is a really great Willie Nelson song, and it made me real happy that they kept at least, you know, the parallels that they do keep. They're tricky. They're tricky, you know? And one of the reasons I think they had to change John Custer is because John Custer fought in the Vietnam War in the comic book. So Jesse was born several years after the Vietnam War, so that when Preacher takes place in amongst, say, 1996 to 2002, Jesse is in his late 20s, early 30s. That's all fucked up if you do it now. Jesse would be either 10 to 15 years older, or John Custer couldn't have fought in Vietnam, which he's not one of those characters you can just say, like, oh, well, then he fought in Afghanistan or Iraq. Like, I mean, I guess you sort of could, but I mean, the whole point with the John Custer stuff is that it's a Vietnam story. Like, there's a part in Preacher, the comic book, where Jesse goes to a Vietnam War memorial to think and talk about his dad. You could modernize some of that stuff, but I don't know if it's necessarily a great idea to do that. So they didn't. They went in a different direction, and I understand why they had to do that. Another one of the critical pieces of Preacher is that Jesse eventually gets his father's lighter, which says "fuck communism" on it. AMC cannot have a prop that says "fuck" that is being shown on screen and talked about as often as Jesse's lighter is in the comic book. So, again, you just gotta change it. You gotta write that out. But what the fuck does "fuck communism" mean to anybody today anyways? If you understand the history of the Vietnam War and what was going on in America at that point, then "fuck communism" totally makes sense. But if John Custer is a more modern person who fought in a more modern, like, the "fuck communism," it's tricky. It's very tricky. I mean, you're almost at a point now where it would be easier to say it was Jesse's grandfather who fought in the Vietnam War. And that would just be weird as well. So instead they just bypassed it. So what are we left with? We also get to see the first usage of the word by Jesse Custer, where we learn that it is a very literal thing that he says, and there's a bit of an implication that he doesn't necessarily control it. In the book, he controls it. It's him. He knows how to use it. It also doesn't work on animals. In the book, you have to be understood to use the Word of God, whereas we see very quickly in the show, it's a very literal version of what it was, perhaps even more so than it was in the book. I always noticed that when the African preacher or priest or whatever in the first bit uses the word, it works on a dog. So even things that don't understand, like, I guess the Word of God creates understanding. It doesn't work that way in the book. In the book, if Jesse speaks with the Word of God to somebody who doesn't speak English, They don't care what he says. So I enjoyed what they did with it. I thought it was a little intense, and it's a dark joke. That's what they're kind of doing with it. Jesse tells somebody that they need to go to their mother and open their heart to her. So a guy goes to his mother, grabs a knife, tears his heart out of his chest, and opens it for her. I get it. I get what you're doing. That's silly. That's fun, it's gruesome and horrible, and at the same time it kind of makes you chuckle, and it gives you a taste of what the series is going to be like. It's going to be a place where things can be a little literal in order for a punchline to land. I'm cool with that. All in all, I really enjoyed the first episode of Preacher. It was the one that gave me the first real taste of how different it was going to be from the comic. And again, there's a lot of places where I cut it some slack because you can see the practical and financial limitations that are placed on it due to it being a pilot. That's just how that goes. If they don't have to show a character's face, they don't show that character's face, so that later on, when the show has more money, they can cast a big name actor for it. I get that. That's totally fair. That's how you make a TV show. Yeah. All in all, I'm not going to say I give it a ranking. I was comfortably able to say after watching the first episode, I'm going to keep watching this show. From the tone of it, I can say, even if I don't really enjoy it, I'm going to keep watching this show because it's good enough to watch. The visual style on it is nice. It's got a sort of unique feel to it. It is sort of reminiscent of the sort of New Mexico big open areas that we saw in Breaking Bad. And at the same time, it's got its own feel. The church is a real nice center point to the whole thing. I wonder if that church is still going to be standing by the end of the season. I'm starting to doubt it. It's interesting. I think some of the best stuff in the episode is the stuff with Jesse and Cassidy. Anytime that Jesse and Cassidy are sharing the screen together, that's when you got something that works. Tulip and Jesse, I'm a little frostier on. I can see that there is some backstory there that I'm very curious about, and the relationships do feel very fleshed out. Personalities feel really clear when Jesse and Cassidy are hanging out. I think maybe it's that I like what each of them brings out in each other. That Cassidy causes Jesse to really sink his heels in and to be a man of determination. And Jesse's stubbornness causes Cassidy to play devil's advocate a little bit louder. And as well, Jesse doesn't really give a fuck about Cassidy's party bro mentality, so you get a little bit less of it from Cassidy, whereas he plays up being a wild and crazy guy when he's hanging out with other people, which, it's a little annoying, and it's supposed to be a little annoying because Cassidy's supposed to be a little fucking annoying. So I think they're getting all that stuff right. I think Cassidy is the most recognizable transition from page to screen. Yeah, unlike Jesse, where when I go back and I'm looking at the book right now, Dominic Cooper is a very different man from that Jesse Custer. Cassidy is Cassidy. That's maybe one of the best ones, and one of the ones they fucked with the least as well. I think they left most of Cassidy's backstory. It seems pretty much what Cassidy's backstory was, whereas Jesse and Tulip have been rewritten from the ground up. And I'm very interested to find out where they're going with that. And admittedly, I'm less interested in where they're going with Cassidy because I already know Cassidy's story, and it sounds like it's Cassidy's story. But yeah, when Jesse and Cassidy are hanging out, be it in the bar or when they get locked up in prison together, that's when you get some really good character moments. It did feel a little bit rushed, but again, it's a pilot episode. They needed to cram in about 4 episodes worth of storytelling into 40 minutes of an episode with very little budget. I think they did a great job with what they had. It was an enjoyable program. I'm looking forward to seeing more. I like the call out to the Saint Killers on Jesse's whiskey bottle. I thought they did a decent job with Arseface. Arseface is a very unique character. There's a sweetness and an openness to that kid that just, it kills you. And the show nails that. The show nails that, but in later episodes, they reveal a couple of things that I feel like almost undermines the message in the first place. I'm a little confused about the direction they wind up going. In the first episode, in the pilot, and in the subsequent few episodes after that, I love our space. I love the actor who's playing them. I think he's just doing a great job. I think the voice and the subtitles is fun. For as much as you can laugh at a kid who tried to kill himself, it is a very tricky balance to strike. And then what we find out later, when we find out that... I'm going to talk about that when we find out about it. I'm not going to give spoilers for subsequent episodes down the road. We're going to talk about that when we get to it. Right now I'm just talking about the pilot episode. Now, I'll tell you, within the first couple of moments of watching True Detective, I knew True Detective was going to be one of my favorite series. And within the first few moments of watching Preacher, I unfortunately knew that Preacher probably won't be one of my favorite series. But I think it might be really enjoyable, and it'll introduce a lot of people to the book. And those ain't bad things. Man, if all it does is make a handful of people laugh and makes a handful more people come in and buy the Preacher graphic novel series, then fuck it, man. I think we count that as a victory. That's been CBMF. We're talking about Preacher, the pilot. I plan to do one of these for each episode of Preacher until we've done the whole season, and then maybe I'll do a big seasonal recap. Yeah. What did you think of Preacher? It seems so weird when I talk to the camera for stuff like that. I'm Hank. This has been CBMF. We've been talking about Preacher. Y'all come back now, you hear?